Howdy, partner, and welcome to Rising. Thanks for tuning in to our show. It's good to see you, and it's good to be with you again, Niall.
Good to see you too, Robbie. It has been a good week, and we're now on the back half, so we're all getting there toward the end of the week, which is a pleasure in itself. In the meantime, as always, lots to talk about. Robbie, what's on your radar?
I'm glad you asked, Niall. Well, Jennifer Rubin is a columnist for The Washington Post and a commentator for MSNBC. Once upon a time, she was considered a conservative writer. Indeed, her hiring by the Post in 2010 was met with controversy specifically because the establishment liberal paper had hired a right-leaning blogger. And in 2013, WaPo's former ombudsman wrote an open letter calling for Jeff Bezos, who had then just bought the newspaper, to fire her for being too pro-Romney and anti-Obama. Well, times have certainly changed. Ever since Donald Trump burst onto the scene, Jennifer Rubin has become a more prolific Never Trump writer and commentator. Indeed, if the dictionary had an entry for Never Trump, her picture would probably appear next to it. She inveighs constantly against Trump and everyone and everything that helps to normalize him. She recently called for people to boycott MSNBC, one of her employers, as a result of Morning Joe host Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski deciding to meet with Trump. Needless to say, she no longer identifies as a conservative. She is not taking the news of Trump's election victory particularly well either, and she has attacked Trump's nominees, Pete Hegseth, RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, Matt Gaetz, and so on, as not merely unqualified, but treasonous. She also had some provocative and, I think some people would say, alarming advice for Democrats on how to tweak their messaging to persuade voters. Let's watch an episode of Jennifer Rubin's podcast.
You can't talk broad themes. You have to boil it down to nuts and bolts, and you have to be pithy. What do I mean by pithy? How about this? Republicans want to kill your kids. It's actually true.
Republicans want to kill your kids. Now, that clip went viral on social media for obvious reasons, but I've learned enough to never quite trust short and potentially taken out of context clips. So I hunted down the rest of the clip. Here's a little bit more so that you know I'm being fair to Rubin and I'm not taking her comments out of context. Let's watch.
If you're going to oppose vaccinations, if you're going to stop breakthrough medical research, if you're going to allow minors and all sorts of people to get semi-automatic weapons, which they use to shoot up schools, well, then you are responsible for kids' health and death, unfortunately. It has to be that simple and that direct, and it has to be over and over and over again.
I guess we weren't taking her out of context. It sounds like she really means it. Republicans want to kill your children. Jennifer Rubin wants Democrats to run on the messaging that Republicans are brutal murderers because they are stopping medical research and allowing people to own semi-automatic weapons. Look, this is some bad faith commentary in the extreme. On the medical research front, Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s view is that the health industry and the food industry are treated too credulously by government regulators, which allow too many defective and potentially harmful products to reach the market. Now, reasonableites can disagree about this, and probably the truth is somewhere in the middle, but wanting extra scrutiny of health products is not the same thing as wanting kids to die. On the contrary, many liberals think regulators ought to be more involved so as to protect kids from consuming harmful products. That's why RFK Jr. was once a Democrat. Now, I actually disagree with them because I think government regulations often create inefficiencies and get in the way of meeting human needs. But I would never accuse people I disagree with of deliberately trying to kill kids. They just have a different point of view. Jennifer Rubin's point on guns is frankly even worse. Now, even if you think the country would be better off, lives would be saved if we had stricter regulations of firearms, well, then you have to deal with a number of complicating issues. 1, the Supreme Court's view of the Second Amendment makes gun control very difficult. 2, the overwhelming majority of gun homicides involve easily available handguns, not semi-automatic weapons. 3, mass disarmament would involve increasing the number of police interactions with minority and economically disadvantaged communities and the mentally ill, and would realistically mean many, many, many more arrests and mass incarceration. So if you're not prepared to face any of those realities, you're going to end up thinking twice about your support for increased gun control. Even enforcing the gun control we have in the books right now is difficult from the liberal perspective if you are concerned about police overreach. You ultimately might decide it's not going to be worth it, and if you make that determination, are you guilty of wanting kids to die? Of course not. But honestly, the problem with Rubin's analysis isn't confined to these two examples. It's her entire worldview. Democrats equals good. Republicans, not just wrong and bad, but evil. They're trying to kill your children. When unhinged people on the far right say things like that the left wants to trans your children, to mutilate your children, I usually make fun of them. But apparently, you can be the liberal mirror world version of that and still be a columnist at the Washington Post and an on-air commentator for MSNBC. Now, I don't believe in cancel culture, so to be clear, I am not calling for anyone to fire Jennifer Rubin. She should not be fired. What she should do is calm down. Maybe some yoga, enjoy the outdoors, work on her psychological health perhaps, because this is not healthy behavior for anyone. I'm concerned about those Never Trump commentators out there and their mental well-being.
You are, but
just screaming that the other side wants to kill your kids.
I don't think you'll be having any afternoon teas or coffees with Jennifer Rubin, however, on that basis. So, look, I am not a regular listener or viewer of her podcast, so I take you at your word that those clips were played in context. I do think that, in general, in the media, one of the peculiarities of DC media in particular is that there's always a very lucrative market for heretics, right? People who can claim either to be conservative and now adopt either a Never Trump position or just a liberal position, or conversely, there are people who pop up on Fox News and other right-leaning networks who I think are essentially, plain Democrats on TV, people who were Democrats 30 years ago and are now indistinguishable in their work.
That now describes most of Trump's cabinet.
Some of Trump's cabinet. I mean, there are also, I just occasionally see people pop up in places like Fox purporting to be a Democratic pollster or Democratic strategist and not seem to believe in really anything that the Democratic Party believes in. With Jennifer Rubin, I wish people would stop describing her as a conservative columnist, because whether that evolution began with her still holding some conservative beliefs and being opposed to Trump, it has now mutated into a completely views that are sort of indistinguishable from people on at the heart of the Never Trump movement or on the left of the Democratic Party. So she is not a conservative columnist in any notable way.
Views that are so partisan and so her podcast, she commonly has on those Lincoln Project people, et cetera, who are to my mind just a grift, who somehow keep taking in donations probably from wealthy liberals who they've hoodwinked into thinking they're effective. They've figured out how to message to Republicans because they were Republicans, so they know the correct messaging, or the messaging that really gets under Donald Trump's skin. No evidence of that whatsoever, that their ad buys are effective. In fact, there's even some evidence of them being anti-effective. Some of the messaging they did against Youngkin in his gubernatorial election totally backfired. They tried to associate him with the Tiki Torch people, and it was an op. They had almost involved like actors to do it, and it was really embarrassing for them. These are the kind of people that unfortunately, that MSNBC turns to as Republican commentators. It's totally out of touch with what actual Republicans believe.
Lincoln Project is an odd one. I know some of those people and remember them as being actual Republican strategists. Rick Wilson, who, for what it's worth, I get on fine with, was at one point very, very considered sort of on the more controversial wing among Republican ad makers and strategists, and I can't remember now who. There was a Democratic candidate who had literally lost limbs for this country, and Wilson, making Republican ads, had made an ad calling into question that person's loyalty or affinity with the country. It may have been Max Cleland, I think. Anyway,
it was.
Yeah, there were all sorts of, there's been a very distinct change there. The thing about the Lincoln Project, I'm never quite sure whether their aim is to help Democrats win elections or simply to sort of troll Trump. And obviously they have raised a lot of funding, whatever that particular objective is. Now, in relation to someone like Rubin, one of the difficulties I have with making the argument that she makes in those kind of terms is that I think its hyperbolic nature causes it to backfire. You and I have discussed the gun control issue, I think, before. I am vastly more in favor of gun control than you are, and I think it would be more effective than you do. But when you start going so far in your language that it becomes, I just think it becomes off-putting to people who might otherwise be persuadable.
Yeah, and what she said there was they want to give semi-automatics to kids. I don't think anyone wants to give. I mean, I disagree with that view. We want to restrict underage people and criminals from having access to firearms, certainly. How to do that is actually difficult and is more complicated than the other side just wants to kill your kids. And again, I make fun of conservatives who are certainly prone to hyperbole of their own, and we call them out when they do that. It just goes to show you that some people are mercenaries. Yeah. The Jennifer Rubins, the Rick Wilsons, et cetera, and they've changed sides, but it's more about their ideology is just being so over the top, irritated about something.
Well, I mean, whatever about any individual people and the counter views that they would make, there's just an enormous amount of money to be made by generating outrage constantly, and I think that's one of the cultural differences.
Indeed. But we are generating money by having sober, rational conversation and debate,
Civil debate.
Informing our readers and viewers, etc. Lots more to come on Rising today. We have interviews with Elizabeth Nolan Brown, my colleague at Reason, and Lee Fang, who was on yesterday, is back with another great story. Stay tuned.
It's been giving me a lot of good advice. I'm looking forward to a hearing. Folks have been very supportive. They've been saying we're going to get a fair process, so it's a great day of momentum for the Trump-Vance administration.
The drama around Attorney General nominee Matt Gaetz is at a standstill for now. Gaetz has, of course, been accused of paying 2 women for sex, one of whom allegedly was underage. He denies those accusations. Many lawmakers are lobbying for the release of a congressional ethics report on his alleged behavior, while others argue it should be kept at close hold. Speaker Mike Johnson has been arguing that the records should not be released because Gaetz is no longer a congressman. He resigned from his post shortly after Trump won the election.
House Ethics Committee ranking member Susan Wild spoke to reporters after last night's 2-hour meeting. Let's watch that.
I'm not going to get into our discussions because I don't believe that we should be disclosing anything that happens in that committee room, and I would not be even commenting to this extent, except that the chairman has essentially suggested that there was agreement of the members of the committee, which there most definitely was not.
Elsewhere on Capitol Hill, lawmakers remain divided, and of course that's no surprise. Here's a bit from members and senators. Let's watch.
I'm totally fine with that. I think that's, he's not a member of Congress anymore. He's a private citizen. Republicans are in charge of the House right now. We chair that committee. President Trump has made him the nominee, and we as a party need to, respect the fact that the American people have given President Trump a mandate to get this country back on track.
Well, I mean, I think this is information that the Senate ought to get. They've got a constitutional obligation to provide advice and consent on this nominee, and there's certainly information in there that I would think they'd want to see.
I'd be surprised if any of this is true. But again, he's very controversial, and the Democrats hate him, and they're going to try to do everything they can to keep him out of that seat.
This is fundamental. This documentation and the report was put together by an absolutely bipartisan panel, equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans. And the resignation of Gaetz at the last minute was clearly designed to stop the public release of this information.
Congress has punted the Gaetz controversy until December the 5th, when the committee will reconvene.
Meanwhile, another controversial Trump pick, Pete Hegseth, is on the hot seat as new details emerge about alleged sexual misconduct involving him. A police report that CNN obtained reveals details that the nominee for Secretary of Defense was accused of sexually assaulting a California woman in 2017. Per the 22-page report, that accuser claimed that Hegseth blocked her from leaving a hotel room, took her phone, and allegedly sexually assaulted her.
The new details lay out competing narratives of what happened between the pair, including conflicting accounts of how intoxicated each one was. Hegseth denies any wrongdoing, and he was not charged with a crime in connection with the allegation. He did enter into a settlement agreement with his accuser, a non-disclosure agreement that is, and the amount of money he paid remains unknown.
Reacting to this news, Richard Hanania posted, quote, "Conservatives focus on the Hegseth rape allegations, say it's unproven, and so admit they don't care if a married man goes around trying to sleep with every married woman he comes across. Republican events no less. MAGA reaches new levels of depravity all the time." And Zed Jelani tweeted, "Police and prosecutors didn't pursue Hegseth, and he deserves due process in that case. He still was unfaithful to his family, and it's catching up to him with this national embarrassment." Look, I don't really care about the marital drama that Pete Hegseth or any other nominee is involved with. People's lives are complicated, and also I can't put any stock in a Me Too allegation that was not prosecuted, and that to me doesn't really matter. The Matt Gaetz situation is much more serious because this is an ongoing. It first of all involves someone who's underage, allegedly, and there is a report about it that I can't quite see. I can't agree with Republicans here that it should remain secret. It's very relevant to a person who was just picked to be Attorney General, and I have to imagine we should be allowed to see it and that we will see it. Isn't someone going to... I mean, you know this better than I do from reporting it. Somebody's going to leak it. We are going to see what it says.
No, absolutely. I mean, obviously, Democrats feel that it should reach the light of day, and I agree that there is obvious validity to knowing what the allegations are.
I'm for disclosure. I don't like when the government keeps things secret. They compiled this report. The American people should be able to decide for themselves.
Yeah, and I assume that the reason... I mean, one can certainly infer from the Republican refusal to release it that it does not exculpate Matt Gaetz and say he's a fantastic stand-up person and there's nothing to worry about here and all the allegations against him are false. Now, look, I take the point that there is a standard that needs to be reached for criminality to be proven beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. There is a different standard regarding whether someone is an appropriate person to serve as Attorney General or not. There have been a number of allegations against Matt Gaetz. Those have not resulted in criminal charges against him. Those are the result of sworn statements in some cases from these two women who have come forward. I am under the impression that as one of those women says she saw Gaetz having sex with a 17-year-old friend, but that she herself and another woman were paid by him for sex. That is creepy behavior. The 17-year-old, if it is true, is criminal behavior. He denies that. The point is, I think, the increasing specificity of allegations against Matt Gaetz that at a very minimum cast a shadow over his suitability for such a sensitive role, or for any role really, at a senior level of government.
Yeah, fair enough. I find it interesting how, I agree with you, this should be taken seriously and we should read the report, and perhaps Matt Gaetz is not fit for this position because of a compromised status. I would rather have Congress or senators or whatever rejecting a nominee for Attorney General because they favor spying on Americans, or because they want to violate our civil liberties, or because they want to prosecute drug crimes very aggressively, or because they're an authoritarian, or policy-related reasons are ultimately what, right? Or is that argument ought to matter to the American people? How this figure is going to impact all of our lives.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess my rebuttal to that, Robbie, is we're not nominating or confirming a policy paper. We're nominating or confirming a human being with all the attributes and assets and liabilities that we all have as human beings. And so if there are patterns of behavior, even patterns that fall short of criminality, that render someone unsuitable in terms of basic character for high office, I don't think it's unfair at all to consider that.
Well, I'm not saying it's unfair to consider it. It's just what matters in terms of character. Consider the Secretary of Defense. If the Secretary of Defense, favors policies of intervening in tons of war and starting military conflict ever, and it's going to result in thousands or millions of deaths, as the invasion of Iraq did, is that not more of a character defect than you had an affair or something while you were married? I
mean, look, in terms of if there are people having consensual extramarital affairs, I don't personally care about that, and for me that doesn't remotely rise to the level of a sufficient character flaw to stop someone from high office. But if you're a man in his mid-30s allegedly having sex with 17-year-olds, or in the Pete Hegseth case, which he denies, there are allegations of actual sexual assault, then that's of a completely different order to sort of moral peccadilloes about what other adults...
Sure, well that's why I don't like or want these two linked together, because what is alleged with Matt Gaetz is much, much more serious, and we should read the report and decide for ourselves.
Well, I mean, what Hegseth alleged to have done is sexually assault someone. The point is the police did not believe there was prosecutable evidence of that.
There's a lot. Matt Gaetz is also accused of just a higher number of incidents and a variety of things. But, you could say, like, Dick Cheney, squeaky clean, right? There's not a whiff of sexual whatever, and was, in my view, a very bad vice president. Was the architect of disastrous policies that ruined the Middle East and got people killed. And I don't know how to, sometimes I get hung up on this, how we care so much about moral defects of a personal nature, and when policy is what we should care about. But not that they're totally mutually exclusive.
I was going to say, I think we can care about both.
I just think if Matt Gaetz goes down, we're going to get an ardent drug warrior, surveillance person, etc., and that will be a shame in that ways, although if the stuff in the report is true, I don't see how anyone probably could confirm him, but we will find out. We'll see how it goes. More Rising right after this.
In an historic move, the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the former Defense Minister, Yoav Gallant. The ICC accused the two Israeli leaders of committing crimes against humanity. This is the first time a Western ally from a modern purported democracy has been charged with war crimes and crimes against humanity by a global judicial body. Let that sink in for a minute. The three Hamas leaders who had been listed on the indictment were since killed by Israel. The war in Gaza began in October 2023 after Hamas invaded Israel, killing about 1,200 Israelis and taking hundreds of hostages. Since the war was launched, more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed. Israel has been accused of using starvation as a tool against the Palestinian people in Gaza, as well as other horrific war crimes. What all this means is that the two Israeli men could face arrest if they enter any country that is a party to the International Criminal Court. That includes all of Europe, but not the United States, Russia, or China. What this also does at a symbolic level is further isolate the Israeli leaders and the US in the eyes of the world, especially the global South.
Those arrest warrants come in the waning days of the Biden administration, further throwing a spotlight on his failed policies in the Middle East. Some say Biden's Mideast policy, in fact, contributed to the Democrats losing the presidency this month. As the Trump administration gets ready to take over the reins, Trump is expected to double down on his support for Israel and Netanyahu, perhaps, or maybe call for them to wrap up the effort in Gaza, as he said it must end soon. Meanwhile, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders has put legislation on the floor Wednesday to block the sale of some offensive weapons to Israel, but the Senate rejected his effort. Now, ahead of the vote, Sanders took to the podium where he said this.
But Prime Minister Netanyahu's extremist government has not simply waged war against Hamas. It has waged an all-out war against the Palestinian people. Madam President, within Gaza's population of just 2.2 million people, and I want people to conceptualize that, that's about the size of New Mexico. 2.2 million people, more than 43,000 Palestinians have been killed, and more than 103,000 injured, a population of about the size of New Mexico. The United States of America is complicit in all of these atrocities. We are funding these atrocities. That complicity must end, and that is what these resolutions are about. It is time to tell the Netanyahu government that they cannot use U.S. taxpayer dollars and American weapons in violation of U.S. and international law and our moral values.
So basically, Robbie, my take on these developments from a personal perspective is that I welcome the ICC arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant. I think there was a very compelling case made when those documents were originally released. The Bernie Sanders comments we'll get to in a second, I think he made a good case, and of course it went nowhere. But, you know, as far as Netanyahu and Gallant are concerned, the issue that I have is twofold. One is the Biden administration's support for them, using vast American taxpayer funds to send weapons and to otherwise aid Israel. And also the fact that in both these cases, it seems to me that there is an argument or evidence on its face that they are guilty of war crimes. It is a war crime to use starvation, again, as a weapon of war. They said they were going to do that, and they did it. It is a war crime to engage in collective punishment of a civilian population, and they said they were going to do it, and they did it. The Biden administration, I think to its shame, doesn't accept anything that I have just said and continues to push back very strongly against the International Criminal Court and any suggestion of war crimes by the leaders of Israel. I think they're wrong.
So there's a lot that I agree with you on pertaining to this issue. For instance, I would have wholeheartedly voted for Bernie Sanders' amendment there. I don't think we need to assist Israel any further. I think our interests are diverging. I think if they want to make war with all of their neighbors and drag us into some greater conflict, we should separate from that. We have our own problems here at home. I also think they killed Yahya Sinwar, the architect of October 7th. They should say mission accomplished and end what is now a wholesale slaughter of thousands of innocent people in Gaza that is unconscionable. I think it's impossible to defend. I wouldn't try to defend it. I don't agree with it. All that said, I will admit I am very skeptical of international criminal court, or I'm certainly more skeptical of international authorities than you are, and that being the proper way to address these issues. I mean, what if they were to put that in practice? If he were to travel to a country and then they were going to try to arrest it, he could perceive that as an attack or an act of war? I mean, that would, in some ways, that's calling for more conflict to address the actions you don't like. So I'm not in favor of that. I am in favor of the opposite of what the Biden administration has done, which is, yes, back Netanyahu at every turn. I don't think that is right. I don't, it starts to get troubling to me. I don't want to defend what they've done because what they've done is horrible. It's not, they were trying to weed out and kill a terrorist organization that has embedded itself in a vulnerable civilian population. And the pursuit of the attempts to kill those terrorists have resulted in thousands of innocent deaths, and I don't think they should have done this to this extent. But I am not sold on that pursuing that is a criminal. It's not. I do not believe their goal was deliberately to murder civilians or to starve on purpose civilians. Now they have been too callous and too willing to stomach basically unlimited civilian deaths in their pursuit of a military objective. Do I think that should be prosecuted by some international criminal court? I would say probably ultimately no.
So let me be clear for a start from the more sympathetic to the Palestinian side. Sometimes,
but I'm maximally sympathetic, and I think they should stop doing what they're doing.
No, absolutely. And to be fair, sometimes people who are more sympathetic to the Palestinians seek to minimize what happened on October 7th. I do not. I think that was a heinous attack. I think that was a war crime in and of itself. There was a deliberate attack. Some members of the military were attacked, but also lots and lots of civilians were murdered, and that's indefensible. But I do think that in relation to the Israeli response, I think that there has been an unspoken but clear effort at ethnic cleansing. I tend to avoid the word genocide, which a lot of people use, because I think it takes you into semantic disputes that are not particularly helpful. 44,000 Palestinians have been killed. That's an astronomical death toll. The reason I do think that it is de facto ethnic cleansing is that they are literally razing areas, pushing people out of those areas, or trying in some instances to restrict aid to the point where people have no option but to move. There are also lots of instances of just terrible individual actions, whether it's the murder, I would call it, of the young girl Hind Rajab, lots of attacks on aid convoys, attacks on hospitals, the use of sniper drones to kill people. It is a conflict or a counter-offensive, an assault by Israel, which was a reaction to a horrendous attack upon them, but which has gone over every line in terms of its own inhumanity. And I hope that Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant do face some.
On some level, isn't that just that's the nature of war is inhuman. We are watching rarely something we do not often see in modern times what a war looks like, a war between the state of Israel and a terrorist organization that is the de facto representative government of. Now they didn't actually choose them, but and I go back in World War II. We were willing to destroy every city in Germany. We would have blown up. We would have nuked every city in Japan until they surrendered. With the modern spin, would we say this resulted in thousands and thousands of the firebombing of Tokyo killed thousands and thousands of innocent people. It was a total war to defeat the people on the other side, and once they surrendered, it was done. And at no point has Hamas surrendered. I'm not really adapting this argument because, again, I think Israel should cease, and we should certainly cease our support of what they're doing. I don't think it's worth it, and they have killed the person responsible for October 7th at this point. But that would be in trying to impose standards of, this is not the way war is supposed to be conducted. Well, we just don't see war conducted on this scale very often now.
Well, no, but there are rules of war. I mean, the nature of rules of war, yes, I take the point that it is a very macabre topic by its nature. But as the international community has still arrived at things that are definitions of war crimes, and if you commit those, you should face consequences for it. And yes, war is inevitably horrible, and yes, lots of people die, but I would argue that this has been especially egregious in just a completely blithe disregard for civilians. That is not to suggest that I would defend the firebombing of Dresden or the dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think those were outrageous events.
Good discussion. Let us know what you think in the comments. I do read them, and we've got a lot more to talk about today on Rising. Stay with us. The state of Texas is following in Louisiana's footsteps. A new Texas bill named the Women and Child Safety Act would ban Texans from taking abortion pills in other states, would also ban any online activity directing people on where to find abortions and medicine related to the procedure. This proposed law would also hold pill manufacturers liable for providing abortion pills to women. Now, if the pill cannot be identified, the state would then hold all pill makers responsible. This bill could infringe on free speech, quite obviously, if it were to become a law, and it would also give internet service providers a reason to block basically all language relating to abortion. The Women and Child Safety Act has both criminal and civil provisions. This bill would have larger restrictions on manufacturing, distributing, mailing, transporting, delivering, or providing an abortion-inducing drug in the state. To break it all down, we are joined by Elizabeth Nolan Brown, senior editor at Reason magazine, a colleague of mine. Nice to see you, Liz.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
So there's a lot having to do with this bill that seems flagrantly unconstitutional, I would say. I would accept that, based on the Supreme Court decision, states can set limits on actually getting an abortion, but can they set limits on speech related to abortion drugs and that kind of thing?
Right. I mean, there are instances in which, speech that directly, incites criminal activity is criminalized, like, offering drugs for sale or offering sex for sale. But the thing here is that a lot of this is legal speech. And because a lot of it is taking place out of Texas. There are people outside of Texas who are talking about where to get abortion pills, talking about how they're a clinic that funds abortion pills or prescribes them. And, they're in states where abortion pills are not illegal. So it's perfectly legal speech for them to be talking about it. And Texas is trying to, go after that and also go after anyone who hosts that sort of speech. The ways they're trying to get around this are by making this a civil liability thing that is not enforced by the state. It's enforced by civil lawsuits. I don't think that gets around the First Amendment, but I think that's one of the arguments they're going to make. And then the bill is also full of all of these little provisions that are like, if any of this, violates the First Amendment, then you can't go after it. But it's like, you kind of can't have a bill that the whole thing is written to violate the First Amendment and then just be like, oh, but also we're going to respect the First Amendment. It's sort of thrown in there as an afterthought.
And if it's a civil lawsuit, who is suing who under the is it anyone can sue a person who engages in this speech? Is that what they are trying to set up here? Because you wouldn't sue the platform if you're someone. That would be crazy. I guess that it could be structured that way. That I'm going to talk about abortion and now sue Facebook for letting me talk about abortion.
Yeah, it's basically structured so that any sort of third party can sue, a platform. And this isn't just social media platforms. It's like domain registrars, web hosting providers, newsletter services, payment processors like Venmo and PayPal. Any of that is included in the kinds of platforms that could be liable under this law. And yes, anybody could go into them. And it specifically says that possession of abortion pills is a crime unless you possess them in order to entrap someone, which is a really interesting thing because, again, the state is not enforcing this. So it's not talking about the state enforcing this through entrapment. It seems like it's saying that like individuals could buy abortion pills in order to entrap people, and then it would be okay for them to possess them, which is just a really weird provision.
So Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was named Secretary of HHS. There's been HHS-related decisions, jurisdiction over the abortion pill mifepristone. That's been a controversy in the last year. RFK Jr. is someone who is controversial for a variety of reasons, but he's actually been criticized by pro-life people lately because he's a former Democrat and is known to be basically pro-choice. What are you expecting to see for the whole mifepristone availability debate, given we know that this is the person who Trump has picked to head the department?
Yeah, because the FDA has approved it, and now we've had, a bunch of court cases saying that, that approval was okay. I think that, we're not going to see it become totally illegal across the country or anything like that. And, like you said, RFK doesn't seem to want to do that. But what they could do, I think they could maybe interfere with the prescribing rules, but again, I'm not clear because again, the FDA is sort of who sets some of the prescribing rules, and HHS sets some of the prescribing rules. So I'm not exactly sure how much jurisdiction, HHS actually has over it.
You and I have both written a lot about, spoke a lot about the efforts undertaken by both Republicans and Democrats to make platforms more, internet providers more liable for the speech that occurs on for the speech of other users that are on those platforms. Democrats, in particular, lately with the kind of misinformation idea, I think this is again a takeaway from their election result, is that there's too much bad information out there on the internet, and if you were able to punish Elon Musk or Mark Zuckerberg for the false things people were saying, then it would be better for Democrats' electoral fortunes in ways that I argue are very clear free speech violations. And then it's always a shame, in my view, to see Republicans, sometimes at the state level, going along with that idea and saying, yes, we need more liability for platforms. Like, well, that's the thing. That's exactly what Democrats have identified as their way to defeat Republicans, is to take down social media platforms in like a flurry of lawsuits. Is this another example of that?
This is definitely another example of that. And it would seem like a lot of this bill directly contradicts the provisions of Section 230 and the federal liability rules that we already have in place. It's interesting that you mentioned that them sort of borrowing a page, the right sort of borrowing a page from the left, because there's this part of it where it says, if you can't determine, like you mentioned, if you can't determine who made the pill, then all of the abortion pill manufacturers can be liable based on their market share. And I was like, that's insane. Like, that doesn't seem like anything that is, possible in US law. And Walter Olson of the Cato Institute actually told me that this was it's not generally accepted, but in a few states, that sort of market share liability is accepted. And it started in the 80s because the left was really trying to hold pharmaceutical companies and other corporations responsible for things. And so they were really the ones pushing this. And the right was like, no, this is highly unconstitutional. We're not into this. And so again, we see this sort of thing where suddenly it comes to abortion, and the right these days is trying to adopt these tactics that just a few decades ago were seen as very leftist and very antithetical to, conservative jurisprudence.
Elizabeth Nolan Brown, thank you so much for joining Rising today. We appreciate it.
Yeah.
National Security Advisor under Donald Trump, John Bolton, has a suggestion for Elon Musk: use all the money saved by the DOGE department and spend it on defense.
The former United Nations ambassador made the comments on CNN yesterday about the DoD budget, which currently sits at $841 billion. Let's take a look.
Look, Musk may have a big role here. It's not entirely clear what Trump is going to do with this Department of Government Efficiency. If we can save a couple $100 billion, I'd be delighted. We can spend it on the defense budget, which desperately needs an increase.
And now, users online are raising concerns about the ability of the department to handle even more money than they have now. One user writing, how delusional do you have to be to say this when DOD can't pass an audit, get massive increases yearly, and has waste and fraud all throughout the department? So will Elon and Trump go for it? Look, I love Elon and Vivek trying to save us money. Let's cut that government waste. John Bolton wants to give it to the Defense Department. The Defense Department just, I believe, has failed yet another audit. I think 7 in a row, if I'm counting correctly. They already can't keep a track of the massive bloated budget that they have. Defense is not the only reason we have too much government spending. Entitlements are a big portion of it. But other than entitlements, defense is the big one. They have tons of money already. It's never enough. No, I do not want to spend the money we save on defense. I want to return it to you, the people.
Well, apart from the fact that I would obviously make a staunch defense of entitlements as an important social safety net, protecting us all from impoverishment and starvation, I broadly agree. Well, I entirely agree, actually, with all that you've said. Oh, I don't particularly care for Elon or Vivek. That's the other point of.
You find them personally distasteful.
I do find them slightly irritating, but that's a whole other question. Look, John Bolton is, of course, as John Bolton does, expressing the standard neoconservative or Republican hawkish position. John Bolton has wanted to bomb Iran for as long as I can remember. I think about 10 or 15 or 20 years now. He is someone who never really saw a problem that he didn't think American military might could be a solution to. And so if there were savings made from the federal budget in other ways, I certainly would not favor dropping them into the already $841 billion pot that is enjoyed by the Pentagon.
Yes, same. It's just, it goes to show you that mindset. Now, John Bolton is not a figure, I think, anymore that is popular with, he's certainly popular with, like, never Trump Republicans. You know, here's another person who, despite having policies that I think are bad and most Democrats and liberals and progressives thought were bad, because he has nasty things to say about Donald Trump didn't listen to him in his desire to have war with Iran. He gets the red carpet treatment. He gets treated as this celebrity anti-Trump person, so principled. What a unique and powerful voice standing up for democracy, etc., because they like the things he says on that topic. He gets to be on CNN and MSNBC, etc., despite, again, advocating war with Iran, advocating just terrible policies, unlimited spending for defense, etc.
He's the male Liz Cheney with much
he is
more.
the Liz Cheney with a mustache.
With much more luxurious.
A very powerful mustache, to be clear. He looks like he's out of, what is that cartoon? Tintin.
Well, before you get this...
He doesn't look like Tintin. He looks like Tintin's friend.
This takes us on a completely unexpected tangent, which is every time John Bolton appears, my mother recalls that there was a British children's TV character of her youth called Mr. Pastry, who I have verified.
Pastry?
And Mr. Pastry does indeed bear a very striking...
Wow!
A very striking resemblance, as Robby is currently verifying on his computer, to John Bolton. So our audience can Google Mr. Pastry and see that resemblance for themselves.
This was some Irish...
British, I believe.
British?
Yes, in the north of Ireland, British TV was shown, and so Mr. Pastry was famous in my mother's childhood.
Amazing.
Now, John Bolton. Briefly, showing my own age here, to your point about Democrats and the changing of the rules, or changing of what bothers them. John Bolton was, of course, himself a recess appointment during the George W. Bush presidency to the United Nations, and Democrats were outraged, perhaps justifiably. I mean, I'm not a huge fan of recess appointments, but now, of course, there's the whole, now he's anti-Trump. Essentially, he gets warmly welcomed into quarters where he was previously excoriated.
Recess appointments, do you think that's what's going to take place to get some of these people over the finish line?
It could be. I mean, I think that...
Couldn't the Senate just refuse to go into recess?
They could, yeah, and that's really the question, whether they will bow the knee to Trump in that particular way. I think they might do. There is a tradition that the Senate doesn't really like to cede its functions to the executive, but there's also a tradition of Republican senators not standing up very strongly to Donald
Trump.
Trump.
That was under different executives.
Exactly. Very different time for sure.
Trump's going to stand up there and say, in the name of security, the first galactic empire, and dissolve that Senate once and for all.
And that'll be the end of it. Then we will be in the dictatorship that Jennifer Rubin and others have warned about.
I guess so. Oh well.
Oh well.
One other thing on all of this, John Bolton has been. I think I remember him saying on CNN, he was on with Jake Tapper. It was a year or two ago, saying that. Implying that he was involved in overthrowing various governments. Do you remember that clip of him saying that?
Yes.
And Jake Tapper just kind of going, "Oh, wow."
Yeah, exactly. It's like totally fine. Exactly. It's great. America gets to overthrow governments. Well done.
Totally rehabilitated if you're now anti-Trump.
As is George W. Bush himself. I mean, George W. Bush is less.
Well, he'd be more rehabilitated if he was louder about being anti-Trump.
Yeah.
He's quietly anti-Trump, so he's slightly rehabilitated. If he spoke up more, they're begging for him to speak up more. They would give him his own channel on MSNBC or his own show. Rachel Maddow could intro for him.
Well, he's quite.
That would happen.
He's quite rehabilitated by being friends with Michelle Obama these days. But
and we like his painting. Even I like his painting.
Yeah, exactly. But if he certainly went down the full Never Trump route, he could get his own MSNBC slot.
Yes, indeed. Still more to come today on Rising. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll be back in just a minute. RFK Jr.'s Make America Healthy Again campaign could be off to a rocky start.
Companies manufacturing snack foods, sugary beverages and cooking oils may want to thwart RFK Jr.'s agenda to reform the food industry as he assumes his role in the Trump administration, where he has been nominated to be head of the Department of Health and Human Services.
Here to give exclusive details on the industry's moves to block this plan is independent journalist Lee Fang. Welcome back once again, Lee.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So how is the industry responding to this pretty vigorous plan by RFK Jr. that he's talked a lot about in interviews and on social media to get these components out of foods that are not in the products that are sold in other countries? It's a uniquely American thing having to deal with it. Some experts saying this contributes to obesity and other problems that Americans disproportionately have, but it's not being taken well by the industry, I take it.
No, it's not being taken well at all. I gained access to a number of lobbyist strategy memos and some other records that show there's been kind of a behind-the-scenes effort to monitor RFK and his Make America Healthy Again agenda and to respond and kind of plan among the many industries that would be affected by some of these policy goals of taking food additives and increasing nutritional standards. These companies are reacting with increasing alarm, and they're planning ways to thwart his agenda. Everything from taking the Senate confirmation process, Kennedy, if he does go through a normal Senate confirmation, not a recess appointment, he does have to get 50 votes, plus the vice president's vote. And there's talk among these lobbyists that, as he seeks out votes from the Senate in a discreet way, senators who are friendly with the agribusiness industry, with the processed food lobby, they can get him to trade away his MAHA agenda items in exchange for confirmation votes. There's also a discussion that, okay, even if he does get into Senate confirmation, he is installed as HHS secretary, the Senate or House appropriations process, they can freeze the FDA or, kind of add in budget riders that prevent RFK from actually implementing his agenda. So, these are some of the legislative strategies that are being discussed behind closed doors to basically tie RFK's hands so he can't actually implement any of his agenda.
So in terms of all of this, Lee, obviously there's a lot here. There's RFK's agenda in this respect. Other people, including me, have been more critical about him in relation to vaccines and some of the past comments he's made about COVID. But sticking with this point about fast food or otherwise unhealthy food, what specific industries are we talking about bringing their muscle to bear on this issue?
Well, there's a lot of kind of new energy on the right that aligns with topics that have been discussed on the left for a very long time. Is this kind of a movement that defies easy ideological or partisan categories. But there's concern around the use of some vegetable cooking oils, a term that's used as seed oils. There's no consensus among nutritionists around the effects of this, but there's some research, some concerns that polysaturated fats or corn-based oils can cause inflammation and some chronic health issues. There's big concerns around sugar, added sugars, including high fructose corn syrup. That's really ubiquitous in the American food system. We're very unique in the world because of our high levels of subsidies to the corn industry. Agribusiness, big processed food companies are incentivized to add corn syrup instead of more traditional sugars to just a slew of different health product or to food products. Everything from cereals to snacks and to of course candy and other processed food items you find in the grocery store. And of course, there's also the fast food lobby. This is a lobby that is very powerful, and the lobbyists that I'm reporting on in this story, they represent McDonald's and other kind of major fast food chains. They're very concerned about this update to nutrition standards and this kind of crackdown on so-called seed oils.
Yeah, that's a good point that we have corn subsidies and I believe some level of tariffs on imported sugar that change the incentives for manufacturers of these products to use, I think we would both argue, components that are not as ideal from a health standpoint. So that would certainly be something to address. RFK Jr. has been talking about these subjects for years and years and years. He was a Democrat in mostly good standing, although his views on vaccines were controversial in liberal or progressive circles for a long time. He's now going to be part of the Trump administration. I'm seeing a lot of criticism of him, wholly ideally being described as a kook or a crazy person. Certainly there are areas of his policy that I disagree with. Even on the health stuff, there's areas I disagree with. But a lot of what he talks about was popular and supported by liberals for years and years and years. So what do you make of them just writing him off? Maybe not all of them, or some of them, certainly. I've seen on cable news, on CNN and MSNBC, writing him off as just some universal crazy person, despite, I think, advancing aspects of an agenda that for a long time they agreed with. Am I wrong?
Yeah, this is the unfortunate political polarization cycle that we see in Washington. Democrats are incentivized to reject every Trump nomination. Same with Republicans, incentivized to reflexively oppose everyone that Biden put up, including folks who might have agreed with some traditional parts of the conservative agenda. But this nomination in particular provides a real opportunity on nutrition issues, on food standards, on health and safety standards on food that I think progressives will be kicking themselves in years to come if they kind of fail to seize this opportunity. Yes, RFK has very controversial views on vaccines and some other issues that are kind of anathema to those on the left, but what he's discussed around updating nutrition standards for school lunches. This is a cause that was championed by pretty much the entire Democratic Party 10 years ago, by Michelle Obama and others, that was thwarted by the processed food lobby, the kind of frozen food industries that have a lot of sway on Capitol Hill. Biden's FDA has discussed updating the healthy label that's currently used in grocery stores right now. Processed food companies can claim that their products are healthy with a very low standard, even if the food is chock full of sodium and added sugars. Those are standards that are imminently about to be released, and if RFK gets in, you could see some continuity there. And there are a few Democrats who have reached out. Senator Cory Booker has kind of gone on a quest over the last few years to really discuss the problem of the inaccessible healthy food options for many people in working class and middle class communities around this country, and the problem of added sugars in our food. This is exactly what RFK is talking about. So there is an opportunity here, but it might be lost to the partisan polarization cycle.
Lee, just one final question. We only have about 30 seconds left. But in your reporting, how confident did you think these lobbyists were about their capacity either to block Kennedy from getting confirmed, or if he is confirmed, blocking his agenda? Do you think they can do that?
Well, look, not these lobbyists, but lobbyists for the same industries. Back when Michelle Obama was proposing, better nutrition standards for school lunches, they were very successful in using very similar strategies. So, they used congressional writers to basically force the classification of frozen pizza as a vegetable. So, Congress kind of forcing the agency's hand because, a lot of these lobbyists, these major industries have a lot of sway with individual members of Congress, with influential members of big, powerful committees. And, there was a lot of strategies, discussed in this piece, reported exclusively with real clear investigations. They discussed this kind of movement from podcasters, from TikTok influencers, from independent media. This is really what Trump tapped into, and a big part of what kind of formed his coalition with RFK. They talked about strategies about shifting advertising dollars from the fast food companies, from the big processed food makers, instead of going to Politico and Punchbowl and these more traditional Beltway outlets, shifting those ad dollars to influence the independent media space, where these ideas have really taken hold with many even Republican voters. So they're discussing kind of both old strategies of using kind of congressional corruption, for lack of a better term, but also new strategies of co-opting this new energy on the right.
Lee Fang, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Breaking news, the conviction of Jussie Smollett, the actor, has been overturned. Smollett, you may recall, in 2019 was accused of perpetrating a fake hate crime against himself, and he was convicted of that, but that conviction is now overturned. Niall, the details here are fairly interesting. So the situation is, so we'll start reminding people what the case is. So in 2019, this actor, Jussie Smollett, he was in the show Empire. He's black, gay. He was allegedly attacked by two black guys wearing MAGA hats or saying MAGA country, supposedly affiliated with Trump, who attacked him recognizing him because he's black and gay. It was then later determined, and there is very substantial evidence to bear this out, that these were one of them was his gym trainer, and that he had in fact paid them to do this to boost his public profile. He has maintained his innocence and said all along that he never did that. I would argue the evidence that he did do that is extremely compelling. He was charged with essentially making a false report, and here's why they've overturned it. So they've not overturned it because they're determining that he's innocent. That was not a part of the finding. What happened is he was initially, he made a kind of plea deal where he accepted community service and forfeited a $10,000 bond in exchange for them not having any more charges and just leaving it at that. That decision outraged people, and so a special prosecutor then brought additional charges, which he was convicted of. The court is saying, given that there was this agreement that he agreed to and he paid that $10,000 to do the community service, it was wrong to bring initial charges. The state can't, now it was a special prosecutor, but the state as an entity can't make a deal with you and then have you fulfill that deal and then say, just kidding, we're charging you anyway. So on that basis, I think I probably agree with this outcome, and it was not controversial. It was a 5-0 decision. This should not, to be clear, this is not a demonstration of his innocence. And one of the reasons I didn't like the initial agreement where he had to pay the $10,000 and get community service, that in and of itself is fine. I don't think Jussie Smollett is not like a danger to the community. We don't need to waste prison resources locking him up. I maintain that from the beginning. But he did not have to admit guilt and responsibility as a part of that initial agreement, and he should have. He should have been required to admit that, yes, he perpetrated this hate crime hoax in exchange for that level of leniency, and he never did that. So I disagreed with the steps taken by the initial prosecutor. That said, that's what they did, and you can't renege on such a deal, so I understand this ruling. But if it allows him to again, in my view, falsely claim he was innocent of what he did, that would be a shame, because I do not believe that he is innocent whatsoever.
Well, I think it is important, as you say, to underline the basis for this ruling, which we are literally learning about a few moments ago. But in the ruling that overturns the conviction, Justice Elizabeth Rochford wrote that she was aware that the case generated a public interest and that many people were dissatisfied with the resolution of the original case, which was the dropping of charges. But then she goes on to say, nevertheless, what would be more unjust than the resolution of any one criminal case would be a holding from this court that the state was not bound to honour agreements upon which people have detrimentally relied. That seems a perfectly good rationale. What she is essentially saying there is prosecutors, if they make a deal, the prosecutor has to uphold their side of the deal as well as the person who is either making a plea deal of some description. And you cannot have a situation where the state offers a bargain of some kind to someone. Someone takes that bargain and incurs some degree of penalty, in this case a fairly minor one, the community service and the forfeiting of the $10,000. But then that person, having made that forfeiture, the state turns around and says, well, we're actually going to prosecute you anyway. That seems like a legitimate argument to be made in Smollett's defense on the procedural.
Yes, I agree with that. The mistake being, again, in the first place, allowing him to get off that easily without admitting to any wrongdoing, even though the evidence that they had records of him paying the brothers, the gym trainer, etc. They had surveillance footage. It was obviously so obviously coordinated. This case generated incredible public interest at the time because of my history as a journalist, having been involved in or writing a lot about hate crimes and hoaxes. I got a lot of when the news came out that he was attacked like this, I got tons of messages and emails from people being like, do you think this is legitimate? You think there are in inner city Chicago people in MAGA hats walking around? And I was like, I don't know. I won't rule it out, but let's wait to hear more before we jump on it. It was something every Democratic politician commented on and then had to walk back or delete. Kamala Harris, I believe, as well, said, condemning this racist MAGA hatred, etc. I mean, a big deal was made out of this, and then it very quickly fell apart. I talked about it on Rising. I did a couple radars on it that were some of my most popular and well-watched videos I've ever made on this program. I got asked to be on Fox a bunch of times consecutively to talk about it, so it was a big topic.
You certainly did a lot more work on this case than I have done and have greater knowledge of the granular detail, frankly. But I think one of the reasons it became so politically important was that it became emblematic of a case that one side wished to make, and then it became emblematic of the case the other side wished to make. And obviously, if it were indeed a fake thing, then that is obviously a fake attack. Alleging an assault that did not take place is obviously not something you should be doing. I think the reason there was maybe a little bit of pushback whenever the thing fell apart was that there was a perception, I think, on the left that it was being utilized to minimize, obviously there are racist attacks that take place, there are homophobic attacks that take place, and I think there was a worry that this, frankly, embarrassing case would delegitimize those.
Sure, but my experience reporting on specifically on-campus hate incidents, bias incidents, and I've looked at a lot of them, I've looked at the statistics involving them, it's incredible to me how often it turned in I remember seeing one study where often they just don't catch the perpetrator, but in a majority of cases where they did identify the perpetrator, it was the victim. It is a non-trivial number of times for campus incidents specifically, where victims of someone writes a slur on your whiteboard or does whatever, where it is that person themselves seeking attention. There was a whole spate of those after Trump's election in 2016, and people claiming this is because of the rise of hatred and the rise of, and again, there are true ones, there are crazy people doing things, and or there are hateful people doing things, but otherwise unprovoked or random instances of hate-motivated violence is not a particularly large category of, I mean, I say this all the time on the show. Most people, I think, presume there's a lot of ideological related violence in this country, but most of it is domestic violence, workplace violence, crime, mental illness, those things. I won't say those are like totally disconnected from hate, but it is rare to have like, I hate my neighbors because they're Democrats or they're Jewish or they're Muslim or they're gay or whatever, and then I attack them. That does happen, to be clear, but it's thankfully a much lower category of violence than a lot of people are aware of.
And just to briefly wrap this up, I do think it behooves journalists to be a little bit skeptical of stories that appear too neat and tidy or to fit into too neat and tidy a box. I was just reminding myself of an older story, which you will, I think, remember from about a decade ago, where Rolling Stone published an account of a rape on a Virginia campus. And I remember reading it and beginning it with a sympathetic view and then thinking, some of these details seem kind of weird, and that story was ultimately retracted. Similarly with Jussie Smollett, there was stuff from the start.
Yeah, the reason I was turned to when the Jussie Smollett thing happened is because of my role in that story. I was the first to write a news article calling it into question, and then I got 48 hours of death threats on every platform, and then the story did fall apart, and that was my first kind of escalation in my career to having a larger media profile, because like you, I started out sympathetic, and then by the end I said, oh, there's a lot here that doesn't look up to, that was not verified. It turned out that the journalists had really failed basic fact-checking, source scrutinizing things that would have immediately, if you had done the bare minimum, would have demonstrated that this story, I think, like the Jussie Smollett story, was not exactly what he said it was. Lots more to get to on Rising today. Thanks for staying with us. Stay tuned. We'll be back right after these messages. Drama, drama, drama. Well, The View unexpectedly cut to commercials yesterday after a messy on-air fight.
Whoopi Goldberg forced the show to go on break after cutting off hosts Sonny Hostin and Alyssa Farah Griffin during an intense debate on school vouchers.
The heated exchange was sparked by the news of President-elect Donald Trump nominating WWE co-founder Linda McMahon for Secretary of Education. Take a listen.
Let me just finish this. So wealthy families are overwhelmingly the recipients of school voucher tax credits. I'm not making this up. This has been studied. In 2020, a 2020 study found that only about half of states with voucher programs require teachers to have a bachelor's degree, require teachers to have training, require teachers to have licensing, require participating private schools.
If I may get in, just to make it a conversation.
But because I have children and because I looked at the private
I went
schools,
to public school. I believe you got to go to private school.
There is zero statistical significance.
You got to go to private school.
Because nobody can figure out what's being said here right now. No, there is no last thing right now. We're going to go to break, and then we're going to come back.
Yes.
Because you can't. What's happening is no one can hear anything anyone is saying. So everybody has to
on it so we can talk.
Well,
that
you know,
goes for you too. My
that's
for word, and she's been talking for 3 minutes.
Testy. I would have been interested to hear the rest of that conversation. I mean, Alyssa Farah Griffin was just trying to get a word in. Sonny Hostin monopolizing things. Alyssa, I think she's often, I've seen some conservatives go after her for not, for ceding too much ground to her liberal co-host, but it is a tough job to sit next to, 4 other people who are dead set against you and try to push back. It's really tough. I know Meghan McCain, who I am friendly with, used to do it, and it's frustrating and got burned out trying to do it. So I tend not to criticize Alyssa even when I think she's going a little softer than she needs to be, because I think any of us in that situation might do that same thing. Good on her for trying to get a point in about Sonny Hostin, who I think she was saying does send her kids or herself was the product of private education and going after school vouchers. Look, the school vouchers, those of us who support school vouchers, we don't want to just make them available for wealthy kids. We want to make them available for anyone, to whatever money is being spent on that kid's behalf into a public school system. Into, by the way, the public school system that it's geographic, that you happen to live in. You have to go to that school. We're saying, why do you have to go to that school? You could go to a different public school that you like better, or a private school, or homeschool, or whatever. give the parents choice and take that money and give it to the kid rather than the school system. It's not supposed to be some transfer to already wealthy. Or and if you want to make it, what it means, test it even, so it only goes to less economically advantaged kids, fine. But right now, under the current system, wealthier families who want to send their kids to private school, they're already paying into the public school system because they're paying the taxes that everybody else is paying, and then they're paying on top of that to go to the private system if that's what their preference is. That's just how it works. So I don't know how beating up on them further makes much sense to me.
So, first of all, I would have liked to have heard more of the View conversation, and not only because it would be fair enough for Alyssa Farah Griffin to get in, but because I also wanted to hear more about the argument that Sonny Hostin was making, which I think was that the standards for schools in receipt of vouchers are in some way more lax than they are for public schools. I don't know whether that is true or not. If it is true, if she has done her research, that seems to be a legitimate concern to have. In relation to the school districts issue, I don't think everyone is strictly, it's not like geographical district determines the sole school you go to, right? There can be some choice, I thought, within a district. Is that not the case?
Well, sometimes there are multiple schools within the district, but you got to be in the district. No. It's very. I mean, this is why this happens all over America, where if you want to go to a different, I mean, people move to get into a different school district, or you say, oh, my kid actually lives with their grandmother, who lives in a different school district, to go to that school. No, it's very zip code based.
But does every district have only, for example, one high school? I mean, obviously, so you could choose within the same school district to go to different high schools.
Yes, I mean, often it's just one. Sometimes there's multiple ones, but and sometimes there's some other options. But in a lot of places, you're just stuck, and the one you're stuck with is not very good. I'm thinking of I went to private school in the school district I grew up in Detroit, Michigan. I think there was one public high school. That was the one you were going to go to. If you're going to public school, you're going to that one, and that one wasn't very good.
Well, what would have happened, Robby?
But in the neighbor,
maybe had you gone to the public school, you would have greater empathy.
But in the neighbor,
for the marginalized populations of Detroit.
Well, to force somebody to do that is so. The school district I lived in, I lived on the border. The school district next door was Grosse Pointe, which is, people know, there's a very wealthier suburbs of Detroit with very nice public schools. But I couldn't go to that school because I didn't live there. And people would argue, well, you're not paying taxes there, so that's not your school. But what we're saying is, why don't we just give all that money to the people, to the families, and then I can go to that one. If I get admitted, I can go to that one. If I can't get admitted, I have to go to this one. Or I can go to private school if I can get admitted, or whatever. Like, that would be a better arrangement than saying I'm sentenced to this. It's a geographic determination.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, obviously I'm at a disadvantage in this discussion in that I very obviously did not go to high school, or for that matter, college in this country. I recall when my daughter was of high school age, living in DC, that there were several choices within DC as to where she might go, and all of which were public schools, and that some of them had specialties. There's a very famous Duke Ellington High School here in Washington, D.C., which, for example, is more has a greater propensity for people performing in the performing arts. Dave Chappelle went there. So there is school choice to a degree.
Affluent cities with giant populations might have more choices, but we're talking about the vast interior of the country where, no, there's one school, and maybe the other school you'd want to go to might be, a 40-minute bus drive or something, and that's not going to be a realistic choice for anyone. But why not just give them the choice if they'd want to do that? Or you have hybrid schools. Right now, what DC has has these hybrid public charter quasi, it's an amalgamation type language schools where they teach real young kids. Either there's a Spanish one, there's a Chinese one, et cetera, and so forth. And you can pick which one you want to go to. And that, again, that's just using the system to create more choice for people.
Let's get briefly back to our friends at the View, because I know we're both fans of
our
that.
Good friends.
One thing that I suspect I'd be in Sonny Hostin's argument, or side of the argument in the general debate. One thing that I didn't like in that exchange that we played, unless I misheard it, was that she said to Alyssa Farah Griffin, because I have children, and then went on to say something else. I deduce from that maybe Alyssa doesn't have children.
Alyssa does not yet have children.
Yeah, I don't think that is ever.
She's recently married.
A appropriate line of argument, and it's such a sensitive topic for all sorts of obvious reasons.
Yeah,
I'm never a fan.
I don't.
That.
No, we don't need to play it again. I don't have children. But I have lots of nieces and nephews that I love very dearly, and I want the country to be a good place for that. One other thing I wanted to say on the standards argument. I mean, it depends what the standards are. Like, for instance, the city of D.C. has for years tried to force on daycare providers increasing standards whereby the daycare workers would need to have education degrees. And that is just a way to take away jobs from people returning from part-time work, immigrants, people who didn't. Look, you don't need a master's degree in education to take care of kids. You need a loving soul.
Sure.
But my mother can do it. My grandmother can do it. It takes I'm not saying it's an easy job. I'm sure I wouldn't be very good at it, but it does not. You don't have to just sit in a classroom to understand it.
I would never cast aspersions on the childcare abilities of Mama Soave or Grandma Soave, but I do think that in general, obviously standards are important. Now, do you need an advanced degree to take care of very young kids? No, obviously not. But I do think that sometimes, respectfully from the conservative perspective, sometimes the argument is, oh, government is demanding too high standards, and other times it's like, well, all these terrible teachers should be sacked. You have to have standards that are useful and appropriate for whatever
standards, yes, but endless credentialing, I have a lot of skepticism is good for. I mean, it's not good for the workers in these positions. So that's you have standards for performance. And that's the other argument you can make for private education or charter schools. If they're doing a bad job, they fail. They go out of business. Whereas the public school system, like other government systems, says we're failing because we need more money. Give us more money.
We seem to be at odds with the public good once again.
All right. Well, you let us know, viewers, in the comments what you think. That does do it for Rising today. Niall will be back tomorrow, right?
With our mutual friend.
You're working harder than I am this week. A full week of Niall. I think it's been delightful. Let us know what you think. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're now available anywhere you can find podcasts. And I will see you next week.